Chapter 3 of your textbook concerns federalism, form of government, and we are going to try to understand the meaning of federalism in the context of American government specifically. Federalism is where power is divided between a national government and subnational units. Federalism is really an exception in global politics. There are fewer than 20 nations that have federalism. Most nations have a unitary government where the national government has all the power. There's also a form of government known as a confederation where the member units remain sovereign. In the United States, our subnational units are called states. In other countries, they have different names, but historically, federalism most often appears where a group of different nations join together, or a group of different sovereign entities join together. For example, the 13 states during the American Revolution. Germany is another example. Germany did not exist before 1870. Instead, there were a bunch of smaller German-speaking nations like Bavaria and Prussia and a bunch of others. And they united in the 1870s to form Germany, as we know it today. And of course, it was split for a while during the Cold War. But Germany is another example of federalism, which came about through history. So trust in government gets stronger as government gets closer to the public. People are very mistrustful of Washington, D.C. It's been this way for a long time, but especially after Watergate. People are far more trustful of their local government. Very frequently, it is the case if you live in a small village like I do, it's often the case that you actually are acquainted with your board members. And you know them, and you can call them up. And they tend to be very receptive, even to the voice of one person, oftentimes. If you think about it, at the federal level, a U.S. representative on average represents about 475,000 people. That's an average. There's some variance at work there because of the size of the different states. But on average, your average U.S. rep represents almost 500,000 people. It's very difficult for one person to get heard by a U.S. representative. Now, this is a chart showing the number of people employed by government at the different levels, and it includes the military. So at the bottom there is the military. Actually, there are fewer than 2 million people who work full-time for the military as their only occupation. The number of people working for the federal government has wavered between 2.5 and 3 million people for the last couple decades. But it's sort of reached a plateau there in the 1980s where it was just over 3 million, and the federal government employs slightly fewer people now. You see the blue bar, the light blue bar, the number of people who work for the state governments has steadily gone up, but the steepest rise is the number of people working for local governmental entities. When I use the term local governmental entities, I'm not just talking about cities and counties. I'm also talking about school districts, forest preserve districts, mosquito abatement districts, community colleges, and so forth. Those are all local governmental entities that employ people. So as the population of the U.S. went up, so has the number of people providing governmental services, and that growth has overwhelmingly occurred at the local level. The vast majority of interactions with government that you will have in your lifetime will occur at the local level. Whether it's getting a ticket from the police or calling the fire department if there's a fire at your house, or even just paying sales tax. The majority of your interactions with government in your lifetime will occur at the local level. Likewise, I would argue the majority of taxes you pay in your lifetime will be local taxes. So power is broken up in the United States. There is a horizontal separation of powers. It's a separation between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. But we also have a vertical separation of powers between the national government and the state governments. Let me go back to this for just a second. Now, I want to point out to you that the Constitution is silent on the existence of counties, cities, towns, school districts, and so forth. The only subnational unit mentioned by the Constitution is states. When they were writing the Constitution in 1787, they included a national supremacy clause. The national laws and the Constitution are the supreme laws of the land. The Supreme Court of the United States is the arbiter of any legal disputes between the feds and the states. There have been times, especially beginning during the Rehnquist Court in the 1980s and continuing with the Roberts Court, there have been times when the Supreme Court has actually sided with the states in some areas. One example of this is the Affordable Care Act. Although the Supreme Court upheld the individual mandate that everyone had to purchase health insurance, it overturned the mandate that the states have to increase Medicaid. There is also a necessary and proper clause in the Constitution. Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers in the Constitution, and all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. This is actually interesting wording. In the 1980s, the chair of the Federal Reserve was a person named Paul Volcker, and he raised rates in such a way that it caused a recession, and so people started going around asking who elected Paul Volcker. The constitutionality of the Federal Reserve comes from this clause. At some point, Congress thought it was necessary and proper to create a Federal Reserve Board. The Commerce Clause. Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the states. This has later been interpreted to include commerce within a state. If you think about it, it's very difficult to think of an item that you might buy that is entirely located within your state and did not include materials from other states or was not transported across other states. The major retailers all have a presence across the United States, and they all ship across the United States. And so the Commerce Clause has just sort of creeped into the commerce that occurs within a state. The General Welfare Clause. Congress has the power to provide for the quote-unquote general welfare. Since the Great Depression, this has included regulation of all commerce, programs to alleviate poverty, and active management of the economy. An example of this is the recent stimulus bill that was enacted in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. That was an example of active management of the economy. The federal government pumped $2 trillion into the economy. It included a $1,200 check for every adult individual, and then more for people who had kids, but that was only part of it. That was active management of the U.S. economy to try to prevent a major recession. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The 14th Amendment is possibly the most important amendment after the Bill of Rights. Initially, the Bill of Rights only applied to the national government. In the wake of the Civil War, in order to protect the rights of African Americans who had been freed from slavery, the U.S. enacted the 14th Amendment. It led to a process that political scientists refer to as selective incorporation. This is a gradual process by which the Bill of Rights, which initially only restrained the national government, was applied to the states. The reasoning is that the 14th Amendment guarantees the rights of all citizens regardless of state. The result was an expansion of national supremacy. Now, there is the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States, that is, the national government of the United States, by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. So what does that mean? Well, it means that people have rights which aren't explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. For example, the Constitution says nothing about having a right to travel. However, the Supreme Court has ruled that, citing the 10th Amendment, we do actually have a right to travel, and we have a right to go and get a passport if we're not like a convicted felon or something. That we have that right as U.S. citizens, even though it's not explicitly listed in the Constitution. The 10th Amendment has been used in states' rights arguments for the last 4 decades, especially since William Rehnquist became the Chief Justice in the 1980s. So why federalism? Well, federalism accommodates the diversity of the United States. What does that mean? Well, if you look at a Census Bureau report on Texas and California, on paper, those states are very similar. But if you look at the political institutions in Texas and compare them to the political institutions in California, what immediately becomes apparent is that Californians have some very different expectations of government than people living in Texas. I'll give you one example. In Texas, they have what's called a citizen legislature. It's basically a part-time legislature that only meets every other year. In California, they have a full-time, professionalized legislature. What that means is that serving on the legislature of California is your full-time job, and there's no limit on the length of session in California. So they meet every year, at least once, usually for months on end in California. The states can also serve as laboratories of democracy. For example, Obamacare was originally Romney Care. When Mitt Romney was governor of Massachusetts, he signed a bill into law that is very similar to the Affordable Care Act that Barack Obama signed years later. This, of course, came back to bite Mitt Romney in 2012 when he ran against Obama. The states serve as proving grounds for new politicians. Many of the recent presidents had previously served in government at the state level. Obama served as a state senator in Illinois. George W. Bush served as the governor of Texas. Bill Clinton previously served as the governor and attorney general of Arkansas, and so on. Now, Donald Trump, of course, is the exception to this rule. There are some drawbacks of federalism. For example, the American experience is not the same for all people. Women, non-citizens, the poor, non-white Americans, LGBT community, they tend to have different experiences based on whichever state they're in. Some states make it very difficult for women to access certain types of birth control. My own research, my published research, and my doctoral dissertation examined how the states treat non-citizens differently and what some of the factors behind that treatment is. I was able to look at the laws that the states enacted concerning people who are not U.S. citizens and determine if these were restrictions or accommodations. And I was able to score the states depending on how restrictive or accommodating they were to non-citizens. And this was published in a peer-reviewed journal. The poor. Some states like Illinois and New York and California and so forth have chosen to expand Medicaid in the wake of the Affordable Care Act. Many states have chosen not to. And so someone who has a level of income that might qualify for Medicaid in one state might not qualify for Medicaid in another state. Federalism tends to exaggerate this because, as I mentioned, the majority of our interactions with government occur at the local level. If you're not receiving Social Security, then you really don't have much of an interaction with the national government, except when they take money out of your paycheck. That's about it. Federalism also leads to redundancies and inefficiencies. There's a lot of duplication of effort. Part of the consequence of federalism is that we have over 80,000 governmental entities in the United States. That statistic includes the states, cities, counties, towns and villages, school districts, community college districts, and so forth. There's actually over 500,000 elected offices in the United States. Why? Because of no taxation without representation. Every school district has to have a board, unless the school district is part of the city government, like the Chicago Public Schools. The Chicago Public Schools are just part of the city government, and so people can go and vote for mayor and aldermen to control the spending at CPS. There's duplication, there's redundancy. You're paying multiple taxes to multiple agencies. I'm about to show you a property tax receipt to illustrate this. Another example is when you go and purchase gasoline. When you purchase gasoline, you're paying tax to the federal government, to the state government, and usually the county and city government as well. And then they typically use those taxes to fix the roads. It's impossible to become educated about every politician on a ballot, I would argue. I'll give you an example. I'm going to show you sort of a facsimile. Well, first of all, here's an Illinois property tax bill from 2010. So look at all of those entities there. You've got Kane County, the Kane County Forest Preserve District, the Elgin Township, the Elgin Township Road District, the South Elgin Village, Elgin School District U46, Elgin Community College District 509, the Gale Borden Library District, the South Elgin Fire District, and the Fox River Water Reclamation District. Those are all of the entities that are taking property taxes from a piece of property in South Elgin in 2010. None of them have gone away. They're all still there. Notice that the K-12 school district, Elgin School District U46, the K-12 school district is the largest portion of the property tax bill. The K-12 system is the most expensive local government expenditure. It's not really surprising when you think about all of the millions of school district or school children in the United States, and the fact that there has to be someone basically with them at all times. I've already shown you this. I'm sorry. Here we go. This is a facsimile of the ballot that you would have seen if you had gone in Cook County, Illinois to vote on Tuesday, November 4th, 2008. So there you see President and Vice President Barack Obama and John McCain running against each other. Everybody knew who those people were in 2008. For U.S. Senator Richard Durbin versus Steve Sauerberg. Representative in Congress Schakowsky versus Unin. State Senator Schoenberg versus Appel. Illinois General Assembly, that is State Representative Julie Hamos was the only name on the ballot. And then you get into Water Reclamation Commissioner, and you have to vote for 3 of these people. And then you get State's Attorney, you get Circuit Clerk, you get Recorder of Deeds, Board of Review, and then you get the judges, people running for judge. In the state of Illinois, we have partisan elections to select our judges. Not all states do it that way. In Wisconsin, judges are selected in a nonpartisan election. In California, judges are actually appointed by the governor, and then they have to go through a retention election. So when you're confronted with all of these names and all of these positions, like what does the circuit clerk actually do? What does the Board of Review actually review? Some of them are pretty descriptive, like Recorder of Deeds, but some of them are not so descriptive. When you're confronted with this, the general tendency is to just vote for one party or the other straight down the ticket. That's not always the case. It's a tendency. That is called the partisan heuristic. It's very difficult to find out information about some of these people. I've actually looked up David Clearwater to see if he became the Water Reclamation Commissioner, and I could not find any information on him whatsoever, which probably means he lost. Aside from being aptly named to serve as a Water Reclamation Commissioner, what were his viewpoints? So let's talk just a little bit about history. I'm going to talk about dual federalism. For most of the 1800s, we had dual federalism, where the federal government, or the national government, I should say, and the states had totally separate spheres of authority. Your state and your local government dominated your civic life. There was very little federal assistance or intervention. In the late 1800s, the only people getting money from the federal government, basically, were Union war veterans, Union veterans from the Civil War, or their widows. People who served in the Confederacy had to go to their various state governments for a pension. In the 1900s, we started to see cooperative federalism, an increased amount of grants from the feds to the state and local government, sharing of responsibilities, overlapping programs. This in particular was true during the New Deal, where Democrats swept to power at both the national and in most of the states as well. This is a nice little graphic I like to show. Is American federalism a layer cake or a marble cake? Layer cake federalism has clear divisions of governing authority between national and state governments. Marble cake federalism mingles governing authority with functions overlapping across national and state governments. I think marble cake federalism does a better job of describing the sort of federalism that we have in the United States, but that's my opinion. Then, in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president. It was a transformative election. It's a very important election for several reasons. One of them was a concept called devolution revolution. One of his famous quotes was, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" He called for a devolution revolution to return power to the states, and he appointed Supreme Court justices who believed as he did. In particular, he elevated William Rehnquist to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And so what we've had from beginning in the 70s, and especially after 1980, we've had something we call new federalism. This is increased revenue generation and policy making by state and local government, a reintroduction of states' rights arguments by the Supreme Court of the United States, and a delegation of power to the states, in particular welfare as an example. During the Clinton administration, he effectively got rid of federal welfare and replaced it with grants to the states. This is actually slightly out of date. Well, let's move on to fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism is the primary means by which the feds control state policies. The national government will provide revenues to the states, but with strings attached. The best example of this, in my opinion, is the Interstate Highway Fund. All 50 states get money from the Interstate Highway Fund, including Alaska and Hawaii. But in order to receive that money, they must set a drinking age at 21, and they must prosecute drunk driving as a crime at the local level. Although the different states prosecute it differently, they all prosecute drunk driving and driving under the influence of other drugs. Because if they don't, then they won't get any interstate highway funds. Sanctuary policies. Many municipalities and even a few states have passed laws that prohibit law enforcement, local and state law enforcement, from cooperating with immigration and customs enforcement. The Trump administration, for its part, has threatened to withhold DHS funding, Department of Homeland Security funding, from governmental entities that refuse to cooperate with immigration and customs enforcement. And this is something that will probably go in front of the Supreme Court. It will really depend on how long Ruth Bader Ginsburg lasts. Categorical grants, that is money from the national government for very specific purposes. It can only be used for that particular purpose. Student financial aid is one example. But then there are block grants, which have become more popular in recent years. In a block grant, the states have a lot more discretion over their use. Welfare is an example. Many states take the block grant for welfare that they get from the federal government and institute their own requirements. Some states require a drug test. Some states require working while receiving welfare, and so forth. The full faith and credit clause of the Constitution means that states must accept court judgments of other states. What that means is that if someone is convicted of murder in Florida and they move up to Maine, they're still a murderer. They're still a convicted murderer. It also leads to extradition of prisoners. If a person is found guilty in one state, then the other states must treat that person like they were found guilty. Interstate privileges. States must grant same rights to citizens of other states. Now, this came up during the debate over same-sex marriage. Initially, in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, which was signed by Bill Clinton, and which mandated that marriage was between one man and one woman. In 2015, after people started getting married in some of the states, or I should say after same-sex couples started getting married in some of the states, they would move back to their home states, like Alabama, for example, where same-sex marriage was not recognized, and they would sue for the privileges and rights of a married couple. When you marry a person, you become legally one entity, which means that person becomes your next of kin if anything happens to you, if there needs to be a medical decision made. If you're laying in the hospital and they have to decide whether or not to pull the plug, it's going to be your spouse that they ask. And so in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that any municipality or governmental entity which issues a marriage certificate cannot discriminate between heterosexual couples and same-sex couples. That is, if they issue marriage certificates to heterosexual couples, they must also issue marriage certificates to same-sex couples. The Race to the Bottom is a term that your book doesn't really talk about, and so that's why I've sort of added it here at the end. Governments actively compete with each other. For example, the state of Texas is trying to lure Tesla Motors away from California. They're trying to get Elon Musk to move production of his electric cars from California to Texas. And the way that they're doing that is by giving him a massive tax break to open a factory in Austin, Texas. So they will actively compete with other states to try to lure business to their own state. It's very common along the Illinois-Indiana border to see billboards from the Indiana Bureau of Tourism pointing out that the personal income tax and the sales tax and the corporate tax and property taxes are all cheaper in Indiana than they are in Illinois. That is an active attempt to lure people from Illinois to Indiana. Even at the local and county level, it's very common to open up a liquor store or a cigarette store or both right outside of Cook County. And then they will advertise no Cook County taxes. Welfare benefits. Now, in the 1980s, there was a controversial hypothesis that poor people will naturally migrate to the state with the most welfare benefits. There was an extensive study done. And what they found is that firms are more likely to relocate for benefits than individuals. It turns out that poor people are highly reliant on networks. An example of a network is your family, or your church, your friends. A lot of poor people don't have cars, and they can't really afford to take Uber to work every day, so they'll ask a friend to drive them to work or a relative to drive them to work. And so the race to the bottom effect with regards to welfare benefits, that didn't pan out. It turns out, as I said, that firms will relocate for better benefits and tax breaks. People rarely do.